2004, police in Fresno, California, showed up at what they thought was a simple child custody dispute. Two women were outside a small house, desperately trying to get their children back from a man inside. Officers had no idea that behind those doors they were about to uncover something truly horrifying. Inside that house was Marcus Wesson, a man who had spent decades controlling his family in ways that almost sound unreal. He wasn't just a father. He was a self-proclaimed prophet, a manipulator, and the leader of his own twisted world. And when police finally stepped inside, they weren't prepared for what they found. 9 bodies, all children, all shot. And standing calmly among them was Wesson himself. This is the horrifying story of Marcus Wesson, the man who turned his own family into a nightmare. So, who was Marcus Wesson? How did a man go from living an ordinary life to orchestrating one of the most disturbing family murders in California's history? Marcus DeLon Wesson was born on August 22nd, 1946, in Kansas. From the outside, his early life seemed unremarkable, but inside his home, things were far from normal. His father was an abusive alcoholic who had a dark obsession with religion, and his mother was a strict Seventh-day Adventist who believed in discipline and obedience above all else. This meant that from a young age, Marcus was taught that he had to follow God's will, or else. As he grew up, Wesson's obsession with power and control started to take shape. He dropped out of high school, joined the army, and served for about 2 years before being discharged. When he returned, he began building his own version of a family, one that would eventually turn into something much darker. In the 1970s, Wesson met a woman named Rosemary, who was already a mother, but instead of pursuing her, he became involved with her 8-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. When she was just 15, Wesson forced her to marry him, and by the time she was an adult, she had given birth to several of his children. But that was only the beginning. Wesson didn't stop with Elizabeth. Over time, he took control of more women. His nieces, his daughters, and even the daughters of the women he manipulated. He created his own isolated world, one where he was the absolute ruler. To outsiders, they seemed like a large, private family. But behind closed doors, Wesson was shaping something far more disturbing. The control and cult mentality. Wesson's control over his family wasn't just about physical dominance. It was psychological. He used religion as a tool to brainwash them, telling them that he was a divine leader chosen by God. He made them believe that he alone could lead them to salvation. He taught them that the outside world was evil, that society was corrupt, and that they had to remain pure by staying within the family. He preached his own twisted version of Christianity, mixing it with polygamy, abuse, and complete submission. And the most horrifying part, he convinced his own daughters and nieces that it was their duty to become his wives. Wesson arranged his family like a cult, forcing the women and children to live in small, cramped spaces. They had almost no contact with the outside world. They were homeschooled, forbidden from talking to outsiders, and completely dependent on him for everything. To make sure no one disobeyed him, Wesson used extreme punishments. If one of the children stepped out of line, he would beat them. If one of the women questioned him, he would threaten them with damnation. He was their father, their husband, and their God, all at the same time. Over the years, the abuse continued. Wesson had children with multiple women in the family, creating a disturbing web of incest, control, and fear. He convinced them that if anything ever happened to him, they should be ready to go to heaven together. And in 2004, That horrifying belief would lead to an unimaginable tragedy. The Day of Horror, March 12, 2004, started like any other day in Fresno, California. But by the afternoon, it would become the site of one of the most horrifying mass murders in the state's history. At around 2 p.m., two women, Ruby Ortiz and Safina Solorio, arrived at a small, run-down house on West Hammond Avenue. They were desperate, panicked. Their children were inside with Marcus Wesson, the man who had controlled their family for years. But now, they had finally broken free from him, and they wanted their kids back. Wesson refused. He stood at the doorway, calm, collected, his deep-set eyes watching as his daughters begged him to let their children go. But for Wesson, this wasn't a simple argument. This was a moment he had spent years preparing for. As the shouting grew louder, neighbors started to gather. They had seen the family before, always together, always quiet. The women wore long, dark robes. The children always seemed obedient. No one knew exactly what went on inside that house, but they could sense something was off. Someone called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived, expecting a routine custody dispute. The women pleaded with them. "He's got our kids. He won't let them leave." But Wesson remained eerily calm, telling the officers that everything was fine. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back inside, shutting the door behind him. The officers waited. They had no warrant, no legal reason to barge in, but something felt wrong. And then, gunshots. The officers rushed to the door, forcing their way in. What they found inside was beyond anything they had imagined. The house was dark, cramped, and smelled of decay. Piles of dirty clothes, old food containers, and rotting furniture filled the space. In the back room, police made a discovery so horrific that even the most experienced officers were left speechless. 9 bodies, children, piled on top of each other, all shot execution style. The gun pressed directly against their eyes before the trigger was pulled. The youngest was just 1 year old. And in the middle of the room, covered in blood, stood Marcus Wesson. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply stood there, looking at the officers, as if nothing had happened. When they ordered him to surrender, he calmly raised his hands and allowed them to arrest him. But the nightmare wasn't over. The real question was, who pulled the trigger? The trial and justice. In the days following the murders, the truth about Marcus Wesson's twisted world began to emerge. Investigators pieced together his disturbing past, how he had manipulated and brainwashed his family, how he had convinced them that he was a prophet, and how he had complete, terrifying control over their lives. But the biggest question remained: who actually carried out the killings? Some believed that one of Wesson's older daughters had pulled the trigger, following his orders. Others argued that Wesson himself had done it, refusing to let anyone take his family away from him. During his trial, prosecutors painted a horrifying picture of a man who had spent decades grooming his family for this moment. They revealed journal entries in which Wesson wrote about going to heaven together, convincing his followers that death was the only escape from the outside world. Survivors took the stand, describing years of psychological and physical abuse. They spoke about how Wesson isolated them from society, how he told them that the government was evil, and that they would be damned if they ever left him. But one of the most chilling details to emerge during the trial was that Wesson had not only acted as a cult leader, he had turned his own daughters and nieces into his wives. He forced them into incestuous relationships, making them believe that bearing his children was their divine duty. Some of the victims he murdered were his own children, born from these horrifying unions. The defense, however, tried to argue that Wesson didn't actually kill anyone. They claimed that one of the older girls, driven by years of brainwashing, had carried out the murders. They suggested that Wesson wasn't a killer, but simply a controlling man whose teachings led to tragedy. The jury didn't buy it. After weeks of testimony, Marcus Wesson was found guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder and 14 counts of sexual assault and incest. The verdict was clear. Wesson was a monster who had built his own twisted kingdom, and when he realized he was losing control, he chose to destroy it rather than let it go. When the judge sentenced him to death, Wesson showed no emotion, no remorse. He sat there, listening to his fate, as if he had already accepted it long ago. Even after his conviction, the scars Marcus Wesson left behind didn't fade. For the city of Fresno, the case was a shock like no other. It wasn't just a crime. It was a revelation of horrors that had been hiding in plain sight. How had no one noticed? How had an entire family lived under this man's rule for so long, without intervention? For the survivors, the pain was unimaginable. Many of them had spent their entire lives under Wesson's control, only to suddenly find themselves thrown into the real world. A world they had been told was evil. Some struggled with guilt, wondering if they could have done something to stop him. Others had to unlearn the years of manipulation, slowly realizing that Wesson had lied to them about everything. Some of the surviving family members refused to believe that he was guilty. Even after the evidence, even after the trial, they still defended him, claiming he was misunderstood. That's the terrifying power of brainwashing. Sometimes even when the truth is right in front of you, you can't see it. The house where the murders happened was eventually torn down. Neighbors didn't want the reminder of what had taken place there. The space was left empty, a haunting symbol of the lives lost. As for Wesson, he remains on death row, waiting for his sentence to be carried out. But even now, he doesn't admit guilt. He doesn't show regret. To him, he was always in control. But the terrifying reality is that Marcus Wesson wasn't some supernatural force. He wasn't an unstoppable villain. He was a man, a human being who, through fear and manipulation, convinced others to follow him into darkness. And that's what makes his story so horrifying. Not just the crime itself, but the fact that it happened at all. Because if something like this could happen, who's to say it couldn't happen again? Wesson's crimes weren't just about the horrific murders, though that alone is horrifying enough. They were about the years of control, the systemic destruction of free will, and the way he turned his own family into prisoners of his twisted beliefs. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a master manipulator, a man who stole not just lives, but minds. Even now, years later, the impact of what he did still lingers. The surviving family members are left to pick up the pieces of a life they never got to fully live. And perhaps most tragically, some of them still struggle to break free from the psychological grip he had over them. But this case isn't just a story of horror. It's a warning. It reminds us how dangerous unchecked power can be, how isolation can be a weapon, how manipulation can be just as deadly as a gun, and how cult-like control doesn't always happen in the middle of nowhere. It can happen in a house just down the street. If you found this story shocking, remember, cases like this don't exist in isolation. Abuse and manipulation thrive in secrecy. If you ever notice something that feels off, a person too afraid to speak up, a family that seems controlled, a situation that just doesn't seem right, trust your instincts. Sometimes, speaking up can mean the difference between life and death. And if you want to see more deep dives into true crime cases like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We cover the cases that make you question reality, The ones that make you ask, how did this happen? Let's keep the conversation going. What do you think is the most chilling part of this case? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next one.